The German resistance against the Nazi regime remains one of the most complex and debated aspects of World War II history. Contrary to the perception of total conformity, there was indeed opposition within Germany emerging from military officers, political groups, religious figures, and ordinary citizens. In this video, we will explore how and in what context Operation Valkyrie emerged, the most significant attempt to overthrow Adolf Hitler from within the system itself. Throughout this analysis, you will understand not only the events, but also the dilemmas, motivations, and risks faced by those who chose to resist during one of the most repressive periods in history. At the beginning of the 1930s, Germany was experiencing a deep political, economic, and social crisis. It was within this context that Adolf Hitler and the NSDAP came to power in January 1933. The consolidation of the regime was rapid. Within a few months, political parties were dissolved or banned, including the Social Democratic Party of Germany and the Communist Party of Germany. Trade unions were dismantled, and state institutions underwent a process of ideological alignment known as Gleichschaltung. In this new environment, the possibility of organized opposition was drastically reduced. Repression carried out by the Gestapo and other regime structures made any form of open resistance extremely dangerous. Even so, opposition to the regime did not disappear entirely. Instead, it began to take on more dispersed and, in many cases, clandestine forms. In the early years, organized political resistance was largely concentrated outside Germany. SPD leadership established structures in exile, while members of the KPD attempted to rebuild underground networks within the country. However, these efforts had limited reach, both due to internal repression and communication difficulties. Inside Germany, resistance developed in distinct ways. Rather than a unified movement, various isolated groups emerged, each with different motivations and objectives. One of the first environments where resistance appeared was within the state apparatus itself, especially among conservative and military sectors. These groups did not necessarily oppose nationalism or authoritarianism, but they were concerned about how the regime was consolidating power and the risks associated with Hitler's leadership. Within the military, there was a tradition of institutional autonomy inherited from earlier periods. Although the army had largely accepted the new regime, it still maintained a certain distance from party structures such as the SS. In this context, some officers began to develop critical views of the government. Among them was Hans Oster, who held an important position within the Abwehr, the military intelligence service led by Wilhelm Canaris. From the mid-1930s onward, Oster began establishing contacts with other individuals critical of the regime. This network included military officers, civil servants, and members of the diplomatic corps. Among them were Hans Bern-Gisevius and Hjalmar Schack. Despite these connections, the resistance faced structural challenges. One of them was the lack of consensus regarding political objectives. While some supported the restoration of a democratic system, others preferred alternative authoritarian solutions, including the possibility of restoring the monarchy. Additionally, many opponents did not fully reject the regime. In some cases, their criticism was more related to foreign policy decisions or the risk of war than to the nature of the system itself. Another important factor was institutional loyalty. In 1934, army officers had sworn a personal oath to Hitler. This commitment made it difficult for many to participate in actions that could be interpreted as treason. The opposition also faced practical limitations. Constant surveillance by the Gestapo made any broader organization highly risky. As a result, resistance networks tended to operate in a decentralized manner with little coordination between them. In the diplomatic sphere, initiatives also emerged. During the tenure of Konstantin von Neurath, a circle of diplomats critical of the regime formed. Among them were Ulrich von Hassel and Friedrich Werner von der Schulenburg. These diplomats maintained contacts abroad and, in some cases, transmitted information to foreign governments. However, their actions were limited and often did not result in concrete changes. By the end of the 1930s, German resistance remained fragmented and relatively ineffective. There was no unified movement, nor a common strategy. Most initiatives were reactive and dependent on specific circumstances. This situation began to change in 1938. That year, Hitler intensified his expansionist policy, turning his attention to Czechoslovakia. The possibility of war with Western powers caused concern within sectors of the military. General Ludwig Beck became one of the main critical voices. He believed that a war at that moment posed a high risk and could lead Germany into a broader conflict. From that point on, more concrete discussions began to emerge regarding the possibility of direct action against the regime. For the first time, sectors of the resistance seriously considered the possibility of a coup d'état. However, even at this stage, internal divisions persisted. There were disagreements about the appropriate timing, the methods to be used, and what should happen to Hitler in the event of success. Some advocated removing the regime without necessarily killing its leader. Others believed that Hitler's physical elimination would be essential for any real change. While these discussions were taking place, members of the resistance attempted to establish contacts with foreign governments, particularly in the United Kingdom and France. The goal was to secure support in case a coup was carried out. These efforts, however, had little impact. Western powers did not demonstrate confidence in the conspirators' ability, and, in many cases, chose to pursue their own diplomatic strategies. The decisive turning point came with the Sudeten crisis and the negotiations that led to the Munich Agreement. When Czechoslovakia was partially dismantled without war, the coup plans lost momentum. The perception that Hitler had achieved his objectives peacefully reduced support for resistance within the military. General Beck was eventually removed from his position, and many conspirators withdrew. The opportunity of 1938 was lost. This episode marked the end of the first phase of German resistance. Despite initial attempts, the movement remained disorganized and unable to act decisively. However, the networks formed during this period did not disappear. They continued to exist in a latent state and would be reactivated in the following years, especially as the war progressed and Germany's situation deteriorated. In the years that followed, new opportunities would arise. But, as would repeatedly become clear, a combination of hesitation, internal division, and external circumstances would continue to limit the effectiveness of the resistance. And as the conflict intensified, the nature of that resistance would begin to change. In the next part, the focus shifts to the period between 1938 and 1941, when the first concrete conspiracies were developed, but ultimately failed in the face of war and the regime's early victories. If the first phase of the German resistance was marked by hesitation, fragmentation, and missed opportunities, the next phase would be defined by something different. Persistence under increasingly adverse conditions, a growing perception of inevitable defeat, and, above all, a final attempt to transform conspiracy into concrete action. At the center of this transition stood a decisive element: the transformation of the Operation Valkyrie from a defensive plan of the regime into an offensive instrument against it. After the military defeats of 1942, particularly at Second Battle of El Alamein, during Operation Torch, and in the Battle of Stalingrad, it became increasingly difficult within German military circles to sustain the idea that the war could still be won. For many officers, the question was no longer whether Adolf Hitler would lead Germany into disaster, but when that would occur, and whether there was still time to prevent even more catastrophic consequences. This shift in perception did not immediately produce action. On the contrary, it intensified an already existing dilemma: how to act against one's own head of state in the midst of total war, with society still partially mobilized in his support and under constant surveillance by the Gestapo. Even so, it was within this environment that the resistance found a new form of articulation. Inside the army, Colonel Henning von Treschow played a fundamental role by reorganizing opposition networks, especially within Army Group Center. At the same time, in Berlin, General Friedrich Olbricht identified a mechanism that could alter the balance of power: Operation Valkyrie. Originally, Operation Valkyrie had been conceived by the Nazi regime itself. Its purpose was to allow the reserve army to take control of internal security in the event of a crisis, such as uprisings by forced laborers, collapse of civil order, or massive Allied air attacks. The plan provided for the rapid mobilization of troops, the occupation of strategic centers, and the restoration of order under military command. What Olbricht realized was that this plan could be reinterpreted. Instead of protecting the regime, it could be used to overthrow it. This transformation required subtlety. In order for Operation Valkyrie to be used by the conspirators, its directives had to be carefully modified without raising suspicion. Orders needed to appear legitimate while containing instructions that would allow for the arrest of Nazi leaders, the disarmament of the SS, and the seizure of control in major cities. Treschow contributed directly to this reformulation. He drafted additional instructions that, at the right moment, would transform an emergency mobilization into a coordinated coup d'état. However, there was a structural obstacle. The plan depended on the commander of the reserve army, General Friedrich Fromm. Fromm was aware of the existence of conspiracies but avoided committing himself. His position was ambiguous. He neither denounced the conspirators nor actively supported them. This meant that, at the decisive moment, he could either enable or obstruct the operation. While these adaptations were underway, the resistance continued attempting to physically eliminate Hitler. Between 1943 and early 1944, a series of failed assassination attempts revealed both the determination and the limitations of the conspirators. In March 1943, Treschow organized a plan to destroy Hitler's aircraft using a concealed bomb. The device was successfully placed on board, but it failed due to technical conditions. Days later, a suicide attack planned by Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf also failed when Hitler left the site earlier than expected. Other attempts involved officers such as Axel von dem Busche, Ewald Heinrich von Kleist-Schmenzen, and Eberhard von Breitenbuch. All of them failed, whether due to schedule changes, technical malfunctions, or difficulties in accessing the target. These failures had cumulative effects. On one hand, they increased surveillance and suspicion within the regime. On the other, they reinforced among conspirators the perception that time was running out. It was in this context that the figure of Claus von Stauffenberg emerged as central. A career officer, nationalist, and initially supportive of certain aspects of the regime, Stauffenberg underwent a gradual transformation, especially after witnessing the realities of war and learning about the regime's policies of mass extermination. Severely wounded in North Africa, he returned to Germany with significant physical limitations, but also with a more defined conviction that the elimination of Hitler was necessary. From 1943 onward, Stauffenberg became a central figure in the conspiracy. His position within the Reserve Army's General Staff gave him direct access to the structures required to implement Operation Valkyrie. More importantly, his role allowed him to attend meetings with Hitler, something essential for carrying out an assassination attempt. During this period, the resistance also faced increasing pressure. The Gestapo intensified investigations, and key figures such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Helmuth James Graf von Moltke, and Wilhelm Canaris were arrested. Civilian and military networks began to be dismantled. At the same time, Germany's military situation continued to deteriorate. After the Battle of Kursk in 1943, strategic initiative passed definitively to the Soviet Union. In the West, Allied bombing intensified, and the expectation of an invasion grew. These factors contributed to a shift in mindset among the conspirators. If earlier there had been hope of altering the course of the war, now the focus shifted toward limiting damage and, in many cases, preserving personal and institutional honor. Even so, the plan continued to advance. The modified Operation Valkyrie outlined a precise sequence: the assassination of Hitler, the activation of the emergency plan, the mobilization of the reserve army, the occupation of strategic centers, the arrest of Nazi leaders, and the formation of a new government. Each step depended on the previous one, and all depended on one central factor: Hitler's death. Without it, the plan would lack sufficient legitimacy to mobilize the troops. By mid-1944, the situation had reached a critical point. The Normandy landings in June opened a new front in the West. In the East, Soviet advances accelerated. Internally, repression intensified, and the chances of a successful conspiracy diminished rapidly. It was at this moment that Stauffenberg assumed responsibility for carrying out the assassination. In early July, he attended meetings with Hitler carrying explosives, but was unable to act, partly due to the absence of other key targets such as Heinrich Himmler. On July 15, an attempt was aborted at the last moment. The exact reasons remain unclear, reflecting the complexity and tension surrounding the operation. 5 days later, on July 20, 1944, the plan was finally put into motion. Stauffenberg brought a bomb in a briefcase to a meeting at the Wolfschanze. After activating the device, he placed the briefcase near Hitler and left the room. The explosion occurred, devastating the conference room. Several officers were killed or injured, but Hitler survived. This single fact altered the entire course of events. From that moment on, Operation Valkyrie, carefully adapted over months, was set into motion under conditions of uncertainty, conflicting information, and growing internal opposition. And it would be within this chaotic and fragile scenario that the final fate of the German resistance would be decided. The afternoon of July 20, 1944, marked the most critical point of all organized resistance within Nazi Germany. Up to that moment, years of conspiracies, debates, and failed attempts converged on a single variable: confirmation of Adolf Hitler's death. Without that certainty, the entire mechanism carefully built around Operation Valkyrie became unstable. Immediately after the explosion at the Wolfschanze, Klaus von Stauffenberg himself believed the objective had been achieved. The destruction of the room, the force of the blast, and the lack of immediate information led him to conclude that Hitler was dead. With that conviction, he quickly left the site and boarded a flight back to Berlin. During this interval, the chain of command faced an information crisis. General Erich Feldjebel, present at headquarters, initially managed to disrupt some communications, but not completely or for long enough. Shortly thereafter, it became clear that Hitler had survived, albeit with minor injuries. In Berlin, however, the situation evolved at its own pace. Information did not circulate uniformly. When Stauffenberg landed around 3 p.m., he encountered an atmosphere marked by hesitation. Some officers already knew that Hitler was alive. Others still believed in the initial report of his death. This mismatch of information had direct consequences. Operation Valkyrie depended on speed and clarity. It was essential that orders be transmitted with unquestionable authority, justified by the claim that the Führer had been killed and that an SS coup attempt was underway. Despite the uncertainty, General Friedrich Olbricht decided to proceed. Around 4 p.m., orders were issued to mobilize the reserve army. Troops began occupying government buildings, communication centers, and strategic points in Berlin and other cities. The plan was beginning to materialize. At the same time, however, forces loyal to the regime reacted. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, in direct contact with Hitler, began issuing counter-orders, asserting that the Führer was alive and demanding the neutralization of the conspirators. These communications reached key officers, including General Friedrich Fromm. At the same time, however, forces loyal to the regime reacted. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, in direct contact with Hitler, began issuing counter-orders, asserting that the Führer was alive and demanding the neutralization of the conspirators. These communications reached key officers, including General Friedrich Fromm. Fromm, whose position had always been ambiguous, made a decisive choice upon realizing that Hitler had survived. He attempted to arrest Stauffenberg and other conspirators at the Bendler Block, headquarters of the Reserve Army Command. He was temporarily prevented by officers still supporting the coup, but his shift in position further weakened the internal cohesion of the movement. Meanwhile, Heinrich Himmler took control of the regime's response. Using the structures of the SS and the Gestapo, he began coordinating repression and restoring a loyal chain of command. One of the most significant moments occurred when Hitler, sufficiently recovered, spoke directly by telephone with Major Otto Römer, commander of troops in Berlin. Römer had initially followed Operation Valkyrie orders surrounding the Ministry of Propaganda. However, upon hearing Hitler's voice, he immediately changed sides and began acting against the conspirators. This reversal had an immediate impact. Troops under the control of the plotters began to withdraw or switch allegiance. The authority of the orders issued in the name of Operation Valkyrie began to collapse. Even so, in several cities, the coup temporarily advanced. In Paris, under General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, SS and SD officers were arrested. In Vienna and Prague, military units occupied Nazi party buildings and detained local authorities. These actions demonstrate that, from an operational standpoint, the adaptation of Operation Valkyrie had real potential for execution. The problem was not the structure of the plan, but its absolute dependence on a condition that did not materialize: Hitler's death. As night fell, the situation in Berlin became unsustainable for the conspirators. At the Bendler Block, internal disagreements intensified. Officers openly debated whether to continue the operation. Around 8 p.m., Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben arrived and expressed strong dissatisfaction with how the coup was being conducted. In his view, the initial hesitation had irreversibly compromised the operation. Meanwhile, units loyal to the regime surrounded the building. Armed confrontations broke out within the Bendeler block itself between officers on opposing sides. Stauffenberg was wounded during these clashes but remained active. The situation reached its conclusion around 11 p.m. when Friedrich Fromm regained control of the building. Seeking to demonstrate loyalty to the regime and perhaps preserve his own position, Fromm organized an improvised military tribunal. In this summary proceeding, Klaus von Stauffenberg, Friedrich Olbricht, Werner von Haeften, and Albrecht Merz von Kornheim were sentenced to death. The executions took place shortly after midnight in the courtyard of the Bendeler block. Other conspirators met similar fates in the hours and days that followed. Ludwig Beck, a central figure in the military resistance since 1938, attempted suicide and was killed after his initial attempt failed. In other parts of Germany and occupied Europe, the reversal was equally swift. In Paris, Stülpnagel was arrested after General Günther von Kluge withdrew his support upon confirming that Hitler was alive. In Vienna and Prague, Loyalist forces regained control without major difficulty. The failure of Operation Valkyrie cannot be attributed to a single factor. It resulted from a combination of elements. Technical failure in the assassination attempt, fragmented communication, hesitation at critical moments, and structural dependence on an unfulfilled condition. Even so, the episode reveals something fundamental about the German resistance. Over the course of years, under intense repression and constant risk, a group of military and civilian actors managed to develop a detailed plan to overthrow the regime from within its own structures. Operation Valkyrie was the culmination of that effort. Its failure did not merely end a coup attempt. It effectively eliminated the possibility of large-scale organized resistance within Nazi Germany. From that moment on, the regime focused not only on continuing the war, but also on systematically eliminating any trace of internal opposition. What followed was a wave of repression that would affect thousands of people, permanently altering the internal political landscape of the Third Reich in its final months. The failure of the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt did not merely represent the collapse of a coup d'état. It triggered one of the most extensive and systematic internal repressions carried out by the Nazi regime throughout its existence. From that moment on, the regime's priority shifted, not only toward continuing the war, which was already becoming increasingly untenable, but toward eliminating any possibility of dissent within Germany. In the immediate hours following the collapse of Operation Valkyrie, a wave of arrests began. The Gestapo, now operating with direct authorization from Adolf Hitler, was granted virtually unlimited powers to investigate, detain, and interrogate anyone suspected of involvement, even indirectly, in the conspiracy. The investigation was facilitated by a decisive factor. Many of the conspirators had kept written records. Diaries, letters, and personal notes were discovered in homes and offices, revealing not only the 1944 plot but also earlier attempts at resistance, including conspiracies from 1938, 1939, and 1943. These findings significantly broadened the scope of repression. Using this evidence, the Gestapo was able to map entire networks of opposition, both within military and civilian circles. Individuals who had not directly participated in the assassination attempt were identified as sympathizers or collaborators and were therefore also targeted. Another central element of this phase was the systematic application of the principle of Sippenhaft, so-called kin liability. Under this policy, relatives of the conspirators were arrested, interrogated, and in some cases sent to concentration camps. The objective was twofold: collective punishment and the deterrence of future conspiracies through fear. Among the leading figures of the resistance, many never stood trial. Some chose suicide upon realizing that arrest was inevitable. Henning von Tresckow, one of the central figures of the military conspiracy, took his own life on the Eastern Front shortly after the failed coup. Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel attempted suicide in Paris. He initially survived but was later executed. Günther von Kluge, whose conduct during the coup had been ambiguous, also took his own life when summoned for interrogation. Others were arrested and brought to trial. These proceedings did not follow conventional legal standards. They were conducted by the People's Court under Judge Roland Freisler, known for his aggressive demeanor and for turning trials into spectacles of public humiliation. Defendants were often denied proper legal defense, frequently interrupted, and subjected to insults. In most cases, sentences had been predetermined. Executions typically carried out by hanging were deliberately prolonged, and in some instances recorded on film by order of Hitler. It is estimated that between 5,000 and 7,000 people were arrested in connection with the July 20 plot. Of these, approximately 200 were executed. However, the broader impact of repression extended far beyond these numbers, affecting entire social, military, and administrative circles. The repression also extended to sectors of resistance not directly linked to the coup. Civilian networks, religious groups, and long-standing political opponents came under renewed scrutiny. Figures such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had already been imprisoned, were executed in the final months of the war. Wilhelm Canaris, whose role in the Abwehr had long been ambiguous, was also implicated and executed after the discovery of additional documents. At the same time, the regime intensified its control over the population. Surveillance increased, denunciations became more frequent, and the space for any form of dissent, even passive, was drastically reduced. Paradoxically, this wave of repression unfolded amid a rapidly deteriorating military and social situation. By late 1944, Germany faced an increasingly unsustainable reality. On the Eastern Front, the advance of the Red Army became unstoppable. Cities were destroyed, millions were displaced, and reports of violence heightened the atmosphere of fear. In the West, following the Normandy landings, Allied forces advanced steadily toward German territory. Internally, Allied bombing intensified. Cities such as Dresden, Hamburg, and Cologne suffered large-scale destruction. Infrastructure collapsed, industrial production was disrupted, and daily life became increasingly precarious. In this context, support for the regime declined, though it did not translate into organized opposition. Fear of the Gestapo, combined with the absence of structured political alternatives, kept the population largely passive. Internal reports from the Sicherheitsdienst indicated a significant decline in public morale beginning in 1943, intensifying after Stalingrad and worsening with subsequent events. Many Germans no longer believed in victory, and a growing portion lost confidence in Hitler. Nevertheless, state control remained effective enough to prevent large-scale open resistance. German resistance did not disappear entirely after July 1944, but it ceased to exist as an organized force capable of decisive action. What remained were isolated initiatives, individual acts, and small groups without the capacity to alter the course of events. In the end, Nazi Germany would not be brought down by an internal coup, but by the combined military efforts of Allied forces on multiple fronts. Even so, the history of Operation Valkyrie and the German resistance reveals the existence of fractures within the system itself, fractures that, although incapable of producing effective change, demonstrate that opposition to the regime did exist, fragmented, limited, but real. It is at this point that the trajectory of organized resistance within the Third Reich comes to an end, not with triumph, but with a recognition of its limits in the face of a system that, until its final days, maintained strict control over the state, the military, and society. Although the collapse of Operation Valkyrie in July 1944 marked the end of organized resistance with a real capacity to overthrow the regime, the final months of the Third Reich still reveal important aspects about the nature of internal opposition, its limitations, and its historical legacy. After the initial wave of repression, the Nazi regime entered a phase of total radicalization. Adolf Hitler, increasingly isolated, began to distrust not only declared opponents, but also sectors that had previously been considered pillars of the state, such as the military itself. Institutional trust, already weakened, deteriorated even further. In this environment, any form of dissent became virtually impossible. Gestapo and the SS expanded their surveillance networks, and German society began to function under an extreme level of control. Denunciations between neighbors, co-workers, and even family members became common, creating a climate of generalized suspicion. Even so, under these conditions, small acts of resistance continued to occur. These actions, however, were essentially individual or limited to small, uncoordinated groups. Many took discreet forms, hiding deserters, helping prisoners of war, avoiding denunciations, or subtly sabotaging production efforts. While limited in strategic impact, these acts indicate that opposition to the regime had not been completely eliminated. Unlike earlier phases, however, there was no longer any structured attempt to alter central political power. On the military front, Germany's situation deteriorated rapidly. By early 1945, the Red Army was advancing from the east, crossing previously occupied territories and approaching Berlin. In the west, Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed deep into German territory. The regime's response was to intensify total mobilization. Improvised units such as the Volkssturm, composed of youths and elderly men, were created in an attempt to halt the enemy advance. These measures, however, held more symbolic than practical value. Within the military command itself, decision-making capacity was severely compromised. Experienced officers had been dismissed, arrested, or executed following the July plot. Those who remained tended to adopt strict obedience, avoiding any initiative that could be interpreted as disloyalty. This scenario reinforces a central element in understanding the failure of German resistance: its inability to build a broader base of support within institutions and society. Even as defeat became evident, the absence of a clear alternative leadership and the fragmentation of opposition groups prevented any coordinated action. At the same time, the Allied advance increasingly exposed the scale of the regime's crimes. The Holocaust became more visible as concentration camps were liberated, documents were uncovered, and testimonies began to circulate beyond Germany. For many who had participated in or been aware of the regime's policies, this reinforced the late realization that an internal rupture should have occurred much earlier. However, in the final months of the war, this realization had no practical consequences. In April 1945, with Berlin surrounded, Hitler retreated to the Führerbunker. There, isolated and increasingly disconnected from reality, he continued issuing orders that could no longer be executed. The structure of the Nazi state began to collapse definitively. Communications failed, chains of command disintegrated, and local authorities made autonomous decisions, often aimed at avoiding further destruction or reprisals. On April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. A few days later, on May 8, Germany signed its unconditional surrender, marking the official end of the war in Europe. With the end of the conflict, a process of reconstruction and historical analysis began, seeking to understand both the functioning of the Nazi regime and the forms of opposition that had emerged within it. Internally, Allied bombing intensified. Cities such as Dresden, Hamburg, and Cologne suffered large-scale destruction. Infrastructure collapsed, industrial production was disrupted, and daily life became increasingly precarious. In this context, support for the regime declined, though it did not translate into organized opposition. Fear of the Gestapo, combined with the absence of structured political alternatives, kept the population largely passive. Internal reports from the Sicherheitsdienst indicated a significant decline in public morale beginning in 1943, intensifying after Stalingrad and worsening with subsequent events. Many Germans no longer believed in victory, and a growing portion lost confidence in Hitler. Nevertheless, state control remained effective enough to prevent large-scale open resistance. German resistance did not disappear entirely after July 1944, but it ceased to exist as an organized force capable of decisive action. What remained were isolated initiatives, individual acts, and small groups without the capacity to alter the course of events. In the end, Nazi Germany would not be brought down by an internal coup, but by the combined military efforts of Allied forces on multiple fronts. Even so, the history of Operation Valkyrie and the German resistance reveals the existence of fractures within the system itself, fractures that, although incapable of producing effective change, demonstrate that opposition to the regime did exist, fragmented, limited, but real. It is at this point that the trajectory of organized resistance within the Third Reich comes to an end, not with triumph, but with a recognition of its limits in the face of a system that, until its final days, maintained strict control over the state, the military, and society. If you made it this far, thank you for staying until the end. Content like this takes time, research, and dedication to produce. If you found this analysis valuable, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support is what makes it possible to continue creating in-depth historical content like this.